All right, Maryland Crabs, we're back for round number 2 with Jerome Segal, who is in the primary for the Democratic ticket for governor of Maryland, and our old friend Dave Lashar, who is Libertarian candidate for governor. And if you listened last week to the last episode, go take a listen to that, because that's going to bring us right to what we're going to jump in here, because in the meantime, we had a very heated discussion off mic about religion, which is my pet passion and obsession, and it was really good, so we probably should have recorded that as well. But we went on for a while where Jerome went and checked his emails. But where we left off last time, we were talking about a couple things. We were talking about libertarian values versus socialistic values. That's compulsion versus incentive. Like, we were talking about the 3-day week. We were talking about how polls may not be reflective of the reality of how people act compared to what they're saying they're going to do.
What they say versus what they do is different.
So I think the election of Trump in 2016 was a perfect example of that.
So let me respond to this thing about what people say. I was talking, the way it came up in the last time, is I was citing this poll that I had done in the 2018 election, asking people about what the American dream was to them. And what I was saying was that 70% of people said that what they really wanted was not to get rich. What they really wanted was security and time. And what they said they wanted is a really secure job. And then they would be prepared to live modestly in order to be able to work only a few days a week, so that they would have time to do the things in life that really matter to them. And of course, each person has their own definition about that. So that's actually what I call sort of the alternative American dream sometimes. I say that that's the objective of Bread Roses Socialism, that we're trying to create the option of people being able to, in fact, choose to do that. And the United States, it's so expensive to meet basic needs that even if you're going to live frugally, you still can't meet your needs on 3 days a week. So that generates a whole social and economic agenda, which is part of my campaign, for social and economic policies that would make it possible for people who earn very little, say minimum wage or a little bit above that, to nonetheless, if they were going to live frugally, to meet their needs on 3 days of work. And that would be making the option of simple living available to everyone, not just to high-flying professional couples that decide to downsize. Now, David responded saying, well, people may say that, but when you get really to their behavior, they don't really choose that. They, in fact, choose to work more and to have the money. And largely correct about what people's behavior is. But I think David's understanding of that was, well, that means that actually they were misstating what their real objectives are and their real values are when they say that this is their American dream, because their behavior is inconsistent with it. Another way of looking at it, and the person who articulated that in a very interesting way, I actually did an honors thesis on economics on his work, is John Kenneth Galbraith. The Affluent Society. That was a novel.
Yeah.
Achievement by the dozen.
That was his name.
What?
That was his name, John Galbraith.
Was it? Well, John Kenneth Galbraith was an advisor to Kennedy, I believe, and ambassador to India. But one of the most read economists of his generation, and he wrote a book called The Affluent Society. And in it, Galbraith had a thesis that was that, except for pockets of poverty, the United States has become so affluent that actually people aren't made any happier by consuming more. We do continue to consume more. The economy grows and private consumption goes up. But he doesn't believe that human happiness goes up. And his explanation, because what needs explaining is, well, if what goes on, and the way he put it was with respect to what economists call the marginal utility of money, which is sort of, what's the extra happiness that you get from the next $1,000 that you earn?
And there's studies about that too.
And Galbraith argued, economists have always known that the marginal utility of money declines, that as you get wealthier, the next $1,000 doesn't mean as much. But Galbraith said, and actually I found something almost identical to this in Aristotle, and it's in my book, which opens with Aristotle. the Graceful Simplicity book. But in any event, what Galbraith said is that the marginal utility of money would be zero, except for two phenomena that keep it above it and basically keep us on what he characterized as a hamster wheel. That is, we keep running more and more, the wheel keeps turning, but it doesn't advance. Okay. And the two things that he mentioned were, he said that, first of all, there's the force of advertising, which basically is creating artificial desires that aren't natural. That was his view. And then the second thing he said is the process of keeping up with the Joneses. That when you see your neighbor pulling up in the larger SUV, or when you see that, your brother-in-law went from that 800 square foot house to a 1,200 square foot house, you feel you've got to have it too. And that's how we went from 800 square foot houses to 2,800 square foot houses. But nobody's happier in the big houses than they were in the smaller. But we put in a hell of a lot of extra work time that we could have avoided if we had stayed where we were. So it's not actually, from that point of view, there's the interaction. There's two things. I mean, there's Wall Street that he viewed, not Wall Street, but Madison Avenue, rather, that he views as, always creating this desire for new things. And that, I agree, is much more complex than that. But, and actually that was one of the things I said as a junior in college. But the other thing of keeping up with the Joneses is enormously powerful. And one reason that it's so powerful is that what people really aspire to in this society is relative status. It's not to be, as it were, opulent in terms of having a physical hoard of good things. It's actually what they want to be is rich, which is relative. In other words, they want to be richer than the other guy and not poorer, because that's where social status comes from.
It's called envy. I'm agreeing with what you're saying here now, right?
Okay.
I do not believe that people are such dupes that whatever Madison Avenue puts forth, people are going to subscribe to. I always found Nader very weak in that respect. I found Galbraith weak in that respect. But avarice, envy, jealousy. Unfortunately, this is part of everybody's human nature.
Well, that's right. But the thing is, one way to respond to it is just to live it out. The other is to recognize this and to figure out how do we avoid it. So I'll give you an example. Look, this is a wonderful book called The Social Limits to Growth, and it's about these kind of phenomena. One of the things he talks about is the parade, right? So the parade is going by, and except for the people in the first row of spectators, nobody can see because it was being blocked by the people in front of them, right? So what happens is the people in the second row get up on their tiptoes, and they can see, right? But then the people behind them can't see, so they get up on their tiptoes. They get on tiptoes. Pretty soon, everybody is up on their tiptoes. Nobody is seeing any better than we did before. But we've all developed, after an hour, incredible cramps in our legs. So this is basically what goes on. Now, when you see that that's the phenomenon, and you don't say, well, that's basic human nature, is that people are always going to stand on tiptoe, and we're going to interfere with each other, and we're not going to make any progress. Somebody says, we need a social invention. How about, bleachers? How about, rather than standing and watching the toe, we build some bleachers? And Galbraith is right on target for that, because what he says? Galbraith says, one thing that we should be doing when we recognize that we're not getting any happier through private consumption is raise taxes. That is, chip in. Everybody should chip in a few bucks, and we'll buy bleachers for all of us. And then we'll sit in the bleachers and watch the parade, and we'll all be better off. So Galbraith actually is the last person that I know of actually to theoretically argue for the value of higher taxes in terms of improving well-being. And I'm with him on that.
I'm assuming you're not.
If empirically the higher taxes brought about the bleachers for everybody, I would be for it too. But the reason I was a Soviet studies major in college, the reason that I was drawn to that as a kid. By the way, I'm not in my latter 70s, but I turn 59 tomorrow.
Is that right?
Yeah. So I'm approaching that 60.
You're 1 year away. You're 1 year away. A very traumatic moment.
But what drew me, so I grew up in, let's just say, suburbia USA, right? Yeah. Some of it was Pennsylvania, some Kentucky, some Ohio. That's where I grew up. And when I got accepted to a good college in New Hampshire and was in the days before the internet and was rifling through an actual book of courses, I zeroed in on Soviet studies. The reason I zeroed in on Soviet studies was twofold. One was because, Jerome, you and I have talked. When I was in high school, I was reading Eugene Debs. I was reading about Huey Long, right? Sure. Populist, right? I knew some Norman Thomas, and I was reading just enough of Lenin, right, to be smitten with the vision. Very seductive.
It's a progressive high school.
It's a seductive vision. But my best buddy ended up being a professor of physics at Michigan. He was probably twisting my mind a little bit on the left side.
Well, you're in college. You're supposed to be on the left.
Yeah. Well, but I got exposed. So I'm rifling through the course catalog, and I see that if I take 2 years of Russian, then between my sophomore and junior years, I get to go to the Soviet Union because it was the Soviet Union back then, right? And so I end up being there the summer of '83. And the short story here is that
peak of it.
Yeah, what I wanted to do was, my question was, I wanted to do was test the question of, if it sounds so good, why is it working so poorly?
George Orwell, Animal Farm.
And what I submit now it's decades later, is the beginning of my learnings. Right? I saw how the word I use about my experience in the Soviet Union is I saw how soul crushing authoritarianism is. Authoritarianism of any sort. It's contrary to human nature. And so what I get back to is, the way we have to judge policy and philosophy and slogans is what happens when they are put into effect. That's what we have to ask. And I submit that the lesson of the 20th century is twofold. One, identity politics is divisive and leads to resentments and vengeance and violence.
It's the cornerstone of our society right now.
Well, so I reject. I see people's souls. That's what. And identity politics is something that I am thoroughly against. But the other thing that I am against is forms of collectivism, which is the same as authoritarianism, because the group ends up telling the individual what to do.
Can I respond?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So couple of things. First of all, Bread Roses Socialism has nothing whatsoever to do with the Soviet Union. Secondly, there always were democratic socialists, which had no truck for communism at all. And in fact, the communists despised the socialists, and the socialists despised the communists. And often they were the most bitter enemy in the political history of the 20th century. My father's group was actually an example of that. He was part of a democratic Jewish socialist organization called the Jewish Workers' Bund in Europe. And their leaders at one point went to the Soviet Union. This is in the 30s. They traveled to the Soviet Union to see if they could work out some reconciliation between the communists in the Soviet Union and these other, democratic socialist movements. And there were two guys. The names are Ehrlich and Alter. Right? They were the leaders of the Bundes movement.
Which is prior to the Russian Revolution, yeah?
No. Stalin is in power.
Oh, gotcha.
Stalin's in power. They're going now to see if they can reconcile socialist movements, in this case in Poland, with communism in Russia. Mm-hmm. Okay? It was between the wars. Ehrlich and Alter, it's actually during the Roosevelt administration, I'll tell you in a second. Ehrlich and Alter go to the Soviet Union, and no one hears from them. A week goes by, no one hears from them. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. No one hears from them. They disappear. It's a worldwide issue. What happened to Ehrlich and Alter? right? It's like Khashoggi, right? Eleanor Roosevelt got involved. Stalin took these two leaders of social democratic movement and cut them to pieces. We don't know how he killed them. He disappeared them.
That's the favorite tool of the Soviets,
He disappeared them, and they never appeared again. Okay? So, socialists, and also even the people who would have been prone, there are people in every political orientation who are prone to not pay serious attention to what the means are that are used to pursue whatever the good is. I would say that the lessons of what happened in the Soviet Union and what happened in communist China are such that that it's not that there aren't totalitarians still on the left. They may be still on all over the place. But broadly speaking, there are very few people on the left who've got a picture of Mao or Stalin on their walls. But at any rate, none of this has got anything to do with Bread Roses Socialism, because we don't even come out of socialism. We come out of simple living. What we're interested in doing is merging those two, and the connections are, first of all, a lot of the policies that will create the simple living option are Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren kind of policies, and Bernie defined them to the American people as socialism. It's a bit of a stretch, but nonetheless, what most Americans now think of socialism, they think
and most
of Bernie.
people said that our version of Bernie's version of socialism would be far to the right of what they have in Finland or Norway and Finland and Denmark.
Let me just say one more thing, David, and then I'll give you
Dave's
the floor.
champing at the bit.
Well, let me just put on the table two things. I won't. So the one thing I wanted to say is that there are some inherent connections between, I would say, the best strands of the socialist tradition and Bread and Roses humanism or Bread and Roses socialism. It has to do with Marx's early writings on alienation as an example, and utopianism of the pre-Marxist utopians. The other thing, and at some point I hope we get to that, the other thing is, I just want to mention the question that I had for you as a libertarian was how you understand freedom. And the typical thing in the literature of this over the, decades was the difference between positive freedom and negative freedom. And the critique of libertarians is that they can only think of negative freedom, that is freedom from the state preventing you from doing such and such. And when I talk about policies in order to make real a certain kind of option, it seems to me that having that option would be something that libertarians would respond to, that people should be able to have an option of choosing to live modestly and work less, but that you don't have that if you don't have social policies. You need the social policies, which we would call to create the positive freedom so that they could have that choice. At some point, I'd like you to address that.
Do I have permission to endorse your positions?
This is what I've been hoping for.
Well, so here's why for the audience out there, the reason that I think that Jerome and I have had, this is not our first conversation together, right? I think the reason that, I find these conversations interesting because testing basics, right? And what I would endorse and recommend to all youngsters out there, all who are enlisted in or smitten by socialism, right, is to turn to Jerome's Bread and Roses version of socialism, because I do not find, from what I know from my conversations with Jerome, I do not find his version to be authoritarian, to be something that you're chomping, to use that word that Tim just used, to impose on others. I've heard you use the word pluralism multiple times, right? Options. I mean, the Quakerism, the basic peace, the decency and simplicity, right? Dignity of work, right? these are all good. My concerns are with socialism as commonly understood and endorsed and supported throughout the West, not
like
just
what?
not. Well, the Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez versions of socialism, where if you disagree with me, you're a lesser human being.
Well, but all right, that aside, but I mean, first of all, I think the three of them are kind of different. I look at Elizabeth Warren, where I think she should have more support on the right than she does. Frankly, I mean,
I don't know. Okay.
But I mean, so we're talking about methodology, the way that they're getting their point across. But what's wrong with their version of the way they mostly it's economic based? I mean,
I don't think any one of those three has any respect for anybody who differs from them and says, no, maybe the world is different. Maybe other policies are valid. I don't get that from any of those.
Yeah, but
three.
I mean, you would say the same thing from the right or from the Republicans, or I mean, everyone is sure that their way is correct. So I'm not defending the way they put their point across.
So maybe that's why the new political paradigm. Maybe we need shifts in politics in America like we haven't seen since the 1840s and 1850s. We need people who are a little bit more idealistic, right? Like Jerome, who's sitting on my left right now, right?
Literally and figuratively.
We need a reconception of there can't be so much arrogance and presumption and that Elizabeth, I know how the world works and the economy works, and I'm going to dictate what the law needs to be. We know how climate is changing and what the laws need to be.
Well, we do know that.
We need more humility. And what I get from Bread Roses version of socialism is the value that's important to me, which is a recognition of human frailty and limits.
Yeah. Let me explain that. Actually, we use a phrase, epistemic modesty, having to do with sort of being modest about what we know. And we make a difference between our knowledge about values and our knowledge about factual causal connections. Causal connections have to do with, what the consequences of doing this are, what the consequences of doing that are. Our view about that is that we should be experimental, we should be pluralistic. Our view is really that what we're most solid on are our values, our vision as to where we want to go, what the good life is, what we respect, what people's rights are, and so on. And we should view basically as allies people who share those values but differ with us as to how to get there. And I think one of the strangest things about American politics actually is that whose side you're on often depend on what specific policies for going from A to B you actually advocate. You could actually share a view that we should go from A to B, and you end up defining right and left in terms of different views as to how to get there. And one of the examples,
explain that.
One of the examples that I point to is Milton Friedman, right? Guru of the right wing. Milton Friedman wrote a very important essay on the negative income tax. He hated government programs. He hated welfare programs. He hated the Great Society and Lyndon Johnson, right? But he had the negative income tax. The negative income tax basically was at tax time for people who are poor, rather than they send tax money to Washington, Washington sends tax money that gets from other people to them. It's a negative income tax, just goes the other way.
So
today,
it's a universal basic income?
Well, just a second. That's what most people say, right? But actually what it is the earned income tax credit, which is not new. The earned income tax credit has been part of American law since the 70s, and guess where it came from? The Nixon administration.
I had no idea.
And the earned income tax credit is the most powerful anti-poverty measure that we have. And it doesn't involve any bureaucracy except the people in the IRS who might, send out the checks and review people's tax forms. But it's not, it's not intrusive. It's not food stamps and so on. And what's amazing is that now people are talking, the response is just what you said, which is, are you talking about universal basic income? And we've got progressive Democratic mayors doing, as it were, what they think is an experiment with universal basic income, because they see it as the cutting edge. And two things. It's not universal basic income because actually they are targeting it on poor people, so it's not universal.
Yeah.
So it actually is a variant of a negative income tax, and it's not new. It actually exists. All that we really should be talking about is, how do we understand earned income? Do we want to widen it so that, maybe it goes to people who can't work or whatever? And also, what's the schedule of benefits? Our proposal actually is just to raise it. Already, the earned income tax credit can give a family a maximum of $6,700 a year, $6,700. So it is big. It's very big what the earned income tax credit is, and that's existing law. Go ahead, David.
Do I have permission to agree with you again? So EITC, great idea. Always, I'm for those approaches. I don't think we should be calling Friedman and Hayek and some. I don't think we should be calling them right wing. Right? These are very moral economists, political philosophers. But basic national income, I want to say. Well, it's obviously not something for the governor of Maryland to decide, right? This is a national issue, but for a voice, right?
Well, I mean, it's happening at local levels.
Well, so as long as what we're talking about when we talk about basic income, guaranteed basic income, if what we're talking about is there should be a number, right? That everybody gets. The number is how much money you should receive. Okay. If you're not receiving it from your employer, you should get it from government. I'm oversimplifying a bit, but I'm actually fine with that. If the money goes, as long as it's not, you're going to get all this money and we're going to keep all the government programs around. Right? Mm-hmm. What we have to, I am totally for getting the money that is raised from whatever taxation we have and agree upon, getting it, instead of funneling it through government programs that they're inefficient, but what they mostly are is unaccountable. Nobody stands for the results of government programs. That's what I learned working at the Department of Health here in Maryland. That was my...
Wait, go back to that. What do you mean by that?
Whether any government program, mm-hmm. right, ends up meeting its stated objectives, ends up fulfilling the mission that justified its passage in this legislature, there's nobody who stands around to stand accountable for the actual results.
No, I agree with that.
So that's my dear libertarian friends out there. Right? They tend to talk about government's inefficient. Yeah, of course, it's inefficient. I'd be willing, and other people certainly are willing, to absorb a certain amount of inefficiency. My critique of the government programs is that they are wholly unaccountable for delivering results. That's why our schools in Baltimore are so terrible. Okay, for example. So let's get back to the income. I would support saying, take the money and just give it to individuals, and then they decide what to do with it, as long as we all have to recognize that some people that get that money are going to make good decisions, some are going to make bad.
So that's not even my position. You got to remember, I actually am not advocating universal basic income. I'm advocating universal basic employment. Right? I'm basically saying you give people a right to a job, but they've got to work for their money.
Well, I don't know how. So,
the earned income tax credit is the cream on top of that. In other words, you can only raise the minimum wage so far. I think the lesson we learned about the minimum wage is that you can raise it higher than people thought without generating staggering amounts of unemployment. But there's an upper limit. You can't go to go to a minimum wage of $30 an hour without, destroying all. Let me just say this. But what I'm saying, in other words, is you've got as high a minimum wage as the economy will actually be able realistically to cope with. And I think it's probably something
the market will tell us.
I think it's something above $15 an hour. But it's not going to be 30, okay? But you can top it off with the earned income tax credit so that people earning, let's say 15 or 16 or 17, get the equivalent of another few bucks an hour from the government through the negative income tax. So what we look for in terms of making the simple living option viable is both the income side and the expenditure side and the tax side. It's really a triangle. So we want to raise the income coming in, whether through the earned income tax credit or earned income through the minimum wage. We want to lower the tax burden on poor people, and we want to dramatically lower the cost of meeting basic needs, what we call need-required labor time, right? The number of hours at a minimum wage that you have to work to satisfy your needs is extremely high in the United States. And so our social programs like the
because our standard of living is so high,
are to drive that down, okay?
So you gloss over the difficult problem in the scenario model that you put forth. And the most difficult problem is, if you guarantee people jobs, and you said, I think, Jerome, you agree, when people show up for their jobs, they have to do their work. I think you use those words. I think the problem is, whether it's a commercial business, a nonprofit organization, or a public agency, the problem is, under that model where everybody's guaranteed a job, how do you fire somebody who shows up and does what infuriates the 19 out of 20 people who are doing the right thing? They don't do their job. They need to be fired. They need to be fired. Yeah. They need to be fired, and nobody needs to be shedding tears for them.
Right to a job doesn't mean that private employers are not allowed to fire people. I mean,
well, government agencies need to be able to fire people too.
The guy who's fired has got to go look for another job. Now, if he can't find one, then he'll come to the government and he'll say, "Look, I've got a right to a job. I can't find one. Get me one." And then they're going to say, "Well, let's sit down and go over your work history. And we've got a meeting set up for you with a counselor. And first of all, let's review why you lost your last 3 jobs. Well, it says here that, you called the boss such and such. And it says here that, you came in late every day and so on." And ultimately, you get to the point where you start to rate, I think, actually, that here's where things cross over. Whereas you worry about, I'd say, what you think of sort of deep human vices like laziness, okay? For me, you get to a point in which the real issue is mental health. That ultimately, what you get to are people who actually are self-destructive or are suffering from different kinds of depression or other things that we don't know about that make them unable to function. And I think there's very few people, especially because what we're talking about here actually is, trying to make it the case that everybody would actually have a vibrant life. I mean, we're not trying to force someone, for instance, into, the coal mines or into working 5 days a week. What we're offering them, in fact, is, look, if you can, stay in the Safeway and put the groceries in the bag for 3 days a week, and what you really want to do is, is to be a photographer. This is the way in which you can do those things that you really love. So, get with the program. And if people can't get with that, then it's worth sort of getting deeper into, what really is the problem here? Just like with homeless people, you'll discover that with, some cases, it's just that they're poor. And other cases, you'll discover there's a lot of mental health problems in this society. It's a very difficult society to function in.
For the chronically homeless, it's 3 things. It's mental illness, it's substance use disorder, and it's what's called dissociation. You've lost or severed your connections to friends and family. I mean, that's the explanation of chronic homelessness.
Can we go back to something you said a few minutes ago? We were talking about salaries, and we were talking about what minimum wage and what have you, and you said, and the market will tell us that. Didn't the market already tell us that right after the pandemic, when everyone's like, when employers couldn't find any employees in these lower paying positions, and people say, well, people are too lazy to work, and that wasn't it. Wasn't that the market saying these wages, which have not gone up in 20 years, and they have certainly not matched inflation, are not enough? People are saying, I won't do that for what you're paying me. Wasn't that the market's? Whenever I hear people talk about what the pure market, that it determines what people will be paid, and if you don't like it, you go somewhere else. And you had all these industries screaming, saying, we can't find people. Wasn't that the market saying, your salaries are way out of whack?
I agree with you totally. Yeah.
Wasn't that then?
We've done two things. One thing is that there has been, coming from the intellectuals in this country, there's been a delegitimization of work for decades now, and it has really begun to have an effect on the younger generation, in my estimation. My estimation is informed by my own experience of working in the working in the IT industry, somebody who hires, manages, teach, mentors, all of the above and more. And there's a longtime economist writer who just came again to my attention today because his book came out. A new book came out today. Joel Kotkin, and he's got some good statistics. And part of what it's talking about in when we broadcast this will have been last week's episode, right? Which is the dwindling of opportunity. Just to throw out a statistic, because this really matters to me. Compared to the early 80s, forget about World War, the 50s and the 60s, compared to the early 80s, 2016 study that Kotkin referred to, the chances of moving from middle class to upper classes, right, the quintiles, has gone down by 20%.
Exactly,
so, right. That's
your upward mobility.
Right. That's reviving the Opportunity Society is what David Lashar is all about. Okay. Now, but what I do not believe at all is that Elizabeth Warren has the answers for us, right? And so what part of what Joel Kotkin is saying is that what we're seeing here as we come out of the pandemic is that we've got long-term and short-term trends taking hold, causing any number of problems that are really quite unsettling. And on the labor market, the history of the open labor markets, the competitive labor and markets in the States is that there for any open job there has been 4 people available. How is that measured exactly? I don't know. I'm just right, and right now it's at 1.2, and I know from my own business that we can't find people in the States to do jobs that there were people lining up to do even 2 and 3 years ago. And it's something has happened. I don't know what that something is, but I'm here to tell you.
Let me just mention
it is
some
very real.
But it's the market.
Well, but the market's adjusting by the market's adjusting by paying more money.
Not much. We've been in a minimum wage of $7 for 20 years.
Well, you're looking. If you are a professional, jobs that were paying $70K 3 years ago are paying $120 and $150K today.
Yeah, but
but what? That's
I'm agreeing with you on that. But what I'm saying that if you are in the lower middle class and you're making $35,000, and people at this point their salaries have not moved in decades, and the price of college has increased 500% since 1975.
I'm not sure how many. Well, so college. What I saw that struck me is the price of college has doubled since the late 90s. In real dollar terms. Right. Adjusted for inflation, which didn't matter until the last year or so.
Which was a jump from the mid 80s too.
But do you think? But do you think the education is twice as good? It is not.
No, I agree with you.
What's driving that cost? It's that Sally. What I suggest, what I'm telling my nephews, I've got mostly nephews. Well, I've got only nephews. I'm saying they're not listening to me on this, but don't go to college and take on all that debt until you know why you're doing so. I think that the assumptions about college that held well for the post-war period
I think this
are no longer holding.
This is an area that we agree on.
All three of us, yeah.
This is an area that we agree on. In fact, at the forum the other night, I was actually calling attention to the absurdity of what goes on in our education system and something called the blueprint for education, a blueprint for Maryland schools that has become law. and it focuses actually on what it calls job and career readiness. And the objective basically is for everyone to get a good job. And what they mean by a good job is a high-paying job. And I say this is all crackpot, aside from the fact that there was no analysis behind anything here in the relationship between the curriculum elements that they favor and these outcomes. But I said that in America, for the most part, actually, with respect to good jobs, what we're doing is we play a game of musical chairs. There are only a certain number of good jobs in the society. People compete for them. They compete for them by going to school and by going to better schools and so on. And you can do these tutoring courses and you can study harder and so on. What happens is that you learn the skills of having to play musical chairs. Every person who gets it, thereby, actually somebody else is left standing. So we don't improve. But it's this incredible fallacy of composition, which is what economists talk about, in Economics 101, which is the belief that whatever works for one person can work for the society as a whole. So you have actually on the campaign, you've got some people running who have a great experience, for instance, with helping small groups of people raise their income by getting much better jobs. And he goes from the fact that there are such programs to somehow or other we should put everyone through those programs, and then everyone is going to go from $30,000 a year to $80,000 a year. And it's so astonishingly stupid and ignorant. I mean, what he's projecting is a growth of the economy at a rate that's about 17 times the highest rate that economy ever grew in any period in American history. It's absurd. But you've got people like that. I mean, they don't understand the basics of economics, and it gets baked in to prescriptions for what we should do and basically for actually driving our students in this direction. And astonishingly, because that's what motivates them, not education, they take out all these loans basically to take the courses that'll allow them to compete better. Not only self-defeating, but they end up saddled with astonishing debt that now their real irony is that the requirements that they spent the money and their loans getting now are being eliminated because the employers and the government are facing the problem that they can't fill the jobs, and they're facing up to the reality that they artificially credentialized these jobs in the first place. No one needed these college degrees for these jobs, and now they're getting rid of them so they can hire people. And so what's left with this are young people who wasted 4 years of their life doing things that they didn't like doing, lost the opportunity to have a really good education, which maybe would have made them love poetry or learn something about Persian art or history or racism or any of the thousands of things that schools can teach that can improve your life. And at the end of it, now they're saddled with debt that they don't know what to do with. And the biggest issue is, how do we achieve fairness and eliminate the debt and blah, blah, all this stuff. And it all circles around these crackpot views of the relationship between school and the economy.
And to build on that, right? So I think we're getting close to wrapping up. Yep. And I think one of the things that I want to, that I've clarified in my mind is that even though, Jerome, you and I have our differences, I think one of the reasons that we have a little bit of attraction of ideas and alignment of politics is that in the end, I see your vision. My interpretation of your vision is that it's very similar to my own end vision, which is it's individuals happy in choosing, how they want to live and empowered to live the way that they want to live, not subservient to others and authority. How we get there, I think we have some different ideas, but I want to build on this education because we've got to change our ideas about what we want and expect from education. And I had a life experience of not getting a degree. It was at Johns Hopkins for international studies. So I pursued the degree for 2 years, master's. My parents paid for it for 2 years, and then I didn't pass the language exam at the end, and so I didn't get the paper on the wall. But frankly, even though I don't have the paper on the wall, I probably never learned more in 2 years of my education. But the first year was in Bologna, Italy. So Hopkins has
It
was good, and I was young, and so in Bologna, Italy, and little known fact, I bet. University of Bologna is the oldest continuously operating university on the planet. Okay, you guys knew that. Right?
I did know that.
Since 1200 yeah. And so it was literally 3 blocks from where Hopkins's Bologna Center wasn't. And so of course we had interaction, and we would go to the Mensa for lunch. We would go there, and here's what was remarkable to me. There were student protests. This was early 90s. And the cost of of the University of Bologna degree, and famously universities much across Europe, was almost nothing. I think it was like $125, $150 a year. And there were protests on the streets because it was going to be raised from 125 to 150, something like that. Right?
Supported by the city.
By the national government, right? But here's the thing. Anything that's underpriced is not only overconsumed, it also deteriorates in quality. And so what you had at University of Bologna and many other universities across Europe that weren't the Sorbonne, right, in Paris, is you had kids spending a decade there, right? A decade, just kind of in stasis, frittering away that decade, because it wasn't it was like babysitting. It was infantilizing, and so one of the cautions I have. One of the reasons I said we need to think about this isn't a governor's. Youth needs to start thinking about why they're going to college, why. And we need to quit talking about everything that college being free. It should be a consequential decision at that.
Right. So this is a big disagreement, and and we should save this really for another time. But let me just mention one thing in terms of my background. So I went to the City College of New York for 4 years. It was completely free, as was Hunter, Queens, and Brooklyn College. All of these were 4-year liberal arts colleges, and they were fully paid for by the taxpayers of New York City, not the federal government, not even the state government. The city had 4 of these, and they were first-class schools, and nobody went to them for 10 years. We went there for 4 years. We went there for 4 years, and then we went on to the best grad schools in the country.
If today's universities were like those universities of yesteryear, I think I might be for sending for free kids to get that kind of education.
Yes, we could talk about
I think the education itself has changed too much.
And where things are, right. Yeah. But it's not just the model of Bologna. There's other things that have happened out there with free schools.
Yeah, we agree. We need to avoid both infantilization and indoctrination.
All right, we solved everything. So, well, gentlemen, I want to say thanks. This is actually really interesting. I could do this, and we probably will actually now do more of this because I like the debate we have going here. Yeah, but in the meantime, you two are both working for you're waving at me. In the meantime, we're both running for governor. So, what's the next steps?
Well, I just, for anybody who has listened this far, right? What should politics be, right? And I think that there are not nearly enough conversations of people exploring issues like Jerome and I have been doing for a few months now, right? Not just on these podcasts. And I don't think that this wasn't about any particular issue. Right? This was talking about direction we ought to be doing and having that talk in a tone that we don't see in American politics these days. And I hope that we'll have more conversations like this, and that more people will be having more conversations like this.
It goes against the national grain, but I hope we can, because I find it fascinating. But so, what's the next stop for you guys?
Well, I actually, as I say, I'm in the primary, and the primary is in 4 days, and it's very unlikely that I'm going to win. And whereas David is actually the candidate, and he's going to be in the race all the way to November. But I'm part of actually. For me, this campaign for governor is a vehicle for building a movement. And the movement is Bread and Roses. And maybe it's Bread and Roses humanism, where Bread and Roses socialism is one division of it, and it's the route that I took. But we have a separate website called breadandroses.us, which is not the campaign website. And it actually lays out Bread and Roses humanism and argues that it should extend and be wide enough to go from Bread and Roses socialism to Bread and Roses libertarianism. And I actually say in there may be no place for Bread and Roses Republicans, however. But I hope there is a place intended for David, and I hope by the time we get through with all this, he'll actually be the first Bread and Roses libertarian. I mean, that's my goal for this series.
So we have your two websites. We have Segal for Governor. That's SEGAL for governor.com.
No, .org.
.org. I'm sorry. Segalforgovernment.org. And then on your side, we got davidlashar.com. So it's LAS.
Lashar with an AR, not an ER.
So it's David LASHAR.com. So go take a look at their websites and explore them. And nice headshots, gentlemen.
Maybe next conversation is about how the role of the press in a proper, vibrant democracy, which I think I think we
can all agree on a lot of that. And I used to work for the news, so I'd like to delve into this.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you, gentlemen.
We're on.
Good luck.
Thank you very much. Yeah.